Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Shackelford, and I am a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to all, but especially to our members, for joining us for this conversation today, marking 10 years since the raid that killed Osama Bin Laden. Before we get started, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. The views expressed by the participants today on the program are their own. This program is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the center's efforts and the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content accessible across our platforms. If you have questions for the panel today, we'll be taking audience questions in about a half hour via ccga.live. You simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite questions there. With that said, I would like to welcome our panelists to the conversation today. Bill Daley is presently Vice Chairman for Wells Fargo and served as White House Chief of Staff from 2011-2012. And Tom Donilon is serving now as the Chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute and was National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2013. Both were present in the Situation Room as Operation Neptune Spear unfolded 10 years ago on May 2nd, 2011. Welcome, and thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
What I'd like to start with today is that from the point of view looking back, the decision to conduct Operation Neptune Spear seems like an obvious choice on many levels. It's been years at that point of trying to hunt down Osama Bin Laden. He'd eluded us for a long time, and now his whereabouts are known. So it seems obvious that we want to go in and take him out. But the decision wasn't a simple one. I'd really like to just start by hearing your reflections on some of the considerations and the dangers that the team at the White House was thinking of at the time, and what the mood was coming up to this event. So Tom, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. It's great to be here today. Great to be here with my friend and colleague of so many years, Bill Daley. I'd say a couple things about this. First of all, as background, 8 months before the raid, the intelligence community came to the president and said that they had the best evidence, if you will, kind of the best analytical case that they had as to Osama bin Laden's whereabouts since he was lost in the mountains of Tora Bora many years beforehand. The case had gone cold for many years. But through the persistence really over two administrations and the intelligence community through President Bush 43 and President Obama, they had come up with this case and this clue, right, and path towards finding bin Laden at this compound in Abbottabad. But it's important to remember the nature of the case that was built. By the end of the process, which was an 8-month process of planning and developing intelligence, there wasn't, Lizzie, a direct evidence case. This is important to remember from a historical perspective. It was an intelligence analytical case. It was the best case that we had since the early 2000s, but there was not a piece of direct evidence. There was not a photograph, right, or a witness or anything like that. It was an analytical case. And indeed, when the president came into the Situation Room on the Thursday evening before the raid and asked for the final recommendations from his most senior advisors. And again, looking back on this, the room was still some of the most prominent Americans in national security that we have, from the current president, then Vice President Biden, to Hillary Clinton, to Bob Gates, to Admiral Mike Mullen, to Leon Panetta, John Brennan. It was a room full of the most experienced people in the country with respect to national security, and it was a split room. This was not a unanimous recommendation to the president. There's a lot of reasons for that, I think, and people can talk about their own views on whether they where they were, that Thursday night. But the president asked, and it was a split room, and that decision came to him. One of the reasons, by the way, is because it was dangerous. And there were implications with respect to our relationship with Pakistan. But I also look back at this and think that history was in the room from years before. And Secretary Gates has talked about this publicly. He was in the White House in April of 1980, working for then National Security Advisor, one of my predecessors, Zbigniew Brzezinski, when a raid went wrong in the desert, a great tragedy in April of 1980, in an effort to rescue hostages who were being held in Tehran, Iran. And that was obviously a terrible thing for obviously the lives that were lost and the service people who were lost, but it was a terrible thing for the country and certainly for the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So this was not at all it wasn't an obvious decision. It was a dangerous decision. There was history to consider. There was a split set of recommendations from the room of really prominent advisors. The nature of the raid itself, and I can finish up on this, was that we decided to do the raid. The president decided to do the raid, as opposed to some other options like a standoff bombing, for example, which would have been a lot safer from the perspective of safety, but it wouldn't have got. We would have probably just gotten a propaganda war about whether or not he was killed or not, and it also would have been more dangerous for non-combatants in the area. So the president went with the raid. It was 160 miles inside Pakistan, flying from Jalalabad, Afghanistan. There were 2 helicopters, 24 SEALs and pilots and a CIA officer and a dog that flew into Abbottabad in the middle of the night. Thousands of miles from Washington, in a place where they had never been and didn't really know what they were going to face. And we saw the kind of in real time during the raid. What happens, the contingencies that have to be planned against when the first helicopter that came over the compound, and initially the SEALs were going to rope down onto the compound, and the helicopter got moved off course for a variety of reasons and crashed in the courtyard of the compound hard. And of course, you see the courage and the planning that we have in our special forces, which are a unique American asset. So I don't think it's right to say it was an obvious decision because of the nature of the case. The president, I'll finish on this question. The president, I think, made this decision for 2 reasons. Number one, it was an opportunity to strike a strategic blow against Al-Qaeda, to take off the battlefield, if you will, the only person who had ever headed Al-Qaeda, Osama Bin Laden. And secondly, I think what determined his decision is his faith in the special forces, because we had obviously worked with them repeatedly in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The president had a lot of confidence in Bill McRaven. We can talk about how he built that confidence in another question. But at the end of the day, that I think is what drove a decision that was, one that was disputed and worried about and planned for months before it was made.
Thank you. Yeah, I just can't even imagine the level of stress in making that decision, particularly as you say, if it is a split room of some of the best minds in national security. And it certainly could have gone very differently. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the considerations and the factors involved, and just the mood in the room on that day.
Well, I think Tom has really raised some interesting points that seem to have been lost in much of the dialogue around the raid. And that was, number one, that it wasn't analytical, as he put it, decision. I've always said, if you had gone in a court of law to get a search warrant based upon the evidence we had, I doubt too many criminal court judges would be granting that search warrant. But there was enough reason, and through a long process. I started as chief of staff, I think it was on January 13th in 11. And on that day, in the presidential briefing, Leon Panetta was there and talked about this compound outside of Abbottabad and explained what their reasoning was. I don't even know whether he mentioned Osama Bin Laden at that point, but it was the high-value target, the ultimate high-value target. So that began a process, and I have to say, Tom Donilon drove this process from day one through the raid. And if Tom kept all the pieces together, there were, I don't know how many meetings in the Situation Room that he ran. And it was a long process. Only the U.S. military, no other military in the world could have pulled this raid off. So it was both a political tough decision for the president and for his team, and it was also a tough geopolitical decision to be made. But the confidence of the military being able to pull off, even though during that period of debate from January to the actual raid, the military was divided. You had Bob Gates at one point saying, who was the Secretary of Defense, saying he didn't think we should do it. And then you had the military chief of staff, Mike Mullen, saying we should and we can pull it off. So this idea that it was an easy decision. So it was a long process driven by Tom, and to a tremendous success. But the president really, I had never been around to see such a tough decision having to be made that close up with the president. And all the forces, and knowing the ramifications, as Tom mentioned, the 1980 raid, which was a failure in Tehran, as a political event in President Carter's life, was probably the nail in the coffin. And so to know the president knowing what was at risk for him as president, for the country, it was a tremendous thing to be part of, to understand the process of pulling this off. And there were moments during it, quite frankly, that were sometimes humorous and sometimes just stressed beyond what one could imagine. But at the end, as I said, and I repeat this constantly, only the US military could have pulled this off. Only those operators in SEAL Team 6 could have pulled this off. No other military could have pulled this off.
So I'm curious, just for context, how often were really big decisions like this that split amongst the senior leadership? Tom?
Well, actually, it's interesting. It's not that often, because you work through these processes, and the processes are kind of constructed to try to come to a consent, to come to a decision, right? In a recommendation that you make to the president. And it is unusual for on a decision of this consequence to have that kind of split in the room, because he was, and this, by the way, as Bill said, this was worked for months. This was not a kind of this wasn't we have an issue in X country, we have to meet tonight about whether to launch a military attack. And so you have to kind of come to the room and do your best with what you know. This was one of those decisions that was interesting in terms of my experience in government. It was one of the decisions where we actually had the opportunity to do all the work. We did all the work on this, right? All the contingencies. And so, it was a pretty fleshed out thing. So it was an unusual circumstance and something of this consequence.
And from the very beginning, options, as Tom mentioned earlier, were put on the table to the president. When the president said to the military, "Okay, you go and then come back to me with the options," and they came back with multiple options, and he took what was the hardest one of the choices put before him, to actually put American military people insert them into another country, in an area they'd never been in, for a unknown person, maybe Osama Bin Laden, maybe not, knowing that at that point, whether it was him or not, you were going to probably fundamentally change the relationship with an ally at a time where we most needed that ally.
Yeah.
But
he prioritized this above all else.
That is a question that I've often had, which is the considerations of doing this without Pakistan's knowledge. And given our fraught relationship over time, how did those, whether it's the legal or the diplomatic considerations of entering Pakistan, how did leadership navigate that decision? And what was some of the fallout that you maybe didn't expect?
Yeah, I'll take that just for a second to go first, not Bill. The first point I'd make, Lizzie, is that the Pakistanis and indeed the world was on notice. In the 2008 campaign, the president, remember, had been asked this question: if you knew where Osama, if Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, you knew he was there, would you go in and take him out? Was a question put that way in kind of a campaign setting, right? And Senator Obama said, "I would." And he got criticized for it during the course of the campaign. And I certainly had this conversation with the Pakistanis after the fact, that you were on notice, that this was the president's view and his intention. Secondly, you could have had an option where you had done a joint ground operation against the compound with the Pakistani military. Our judgment, and the judgment was reached pretty quickly based on a lot of evidence, frankly. That in fact that we couldn't maintain operational security at the level we needed to, and work with the Pakistani military with respect to this operation. That was the judgment. We had a lot of experience on this. and it just wasn't going to be. It just wasn't going to be the case. Thirdly, with respect to the legal aspects of it that you asked about, this was a situation where we had reason to believe that either the Pakistanis wouldn't do it or couldn't do it, right? And this was obviously a continuing threat to the United States, and had been since this was the person who launched the 9/11 attacks. That we had the legal right to go defend ourselves because we couldn't have any confidence that they either would or could deal with this. Indeed, he had been there for a while and they hadn't dealt with it, right? And we had an active safe haven in Pakistan for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. So it was considered, it was discussed, and then on the fallout, we can talk about that. We knew there would be fallout on it, and we were prepared to deal with that. We had pretty good relations with the Pakistani military, but it became very politicized inside Pakistan after the raid. And indeed, at some point, we had difficult times afterwards, and at some point, we actually lost access from the southern route into Afghanistan. But this all carefully considered. But again, I think if you were making the decision, you have to ask yourself, is it possible to do this with any sense of competence and operational security? And the answer just was no. And if operational security was blown, we might not find him again for another 10 years.
Yeah, I don't think there was never any doubt that you could not do this if it required us talking and engaging the Pakistanis. It was just if he was there, again, if he was there. And that decision was made very early. And that, quite frankly, putting that issue aside, gave us the ability, and I think the military and the intelligence community, to do our own thing without worrying about engaging anyone else, and trying to be careful through the whole process, that through whatever means we were doing, they would not discover our involvement up until the raid. And again, only the U.S. military and our intelligence could have pulled that off.
Yeah, and at some point, Lizzie, during the course of the discussion on this, there arose the critical question of what would we do? What would the forces do that were on the ground there in the event that the Pakistanis, and as Bill said, there was a major military institution in Abbottabad. There was an infantry battalion in Abbottabad. What would we do if, in fact, we were discovered and our exit was impeded by the Pakistani military or the police in Abbottabad? And and then we went through a lot of options in terms of including talking to the Pakistani senior military, and the president rejected that and said, basically that I want to have all the capability for you to give me the best assurances you can that we can get ourselves out of there, fight our way out of there, get ourselves out of there with our own resources, and that's one of the conditions on which the plan was made. And Bill McRaven's talked eloquently about all the different contingencies that were there that would enable us to enable our forces to get themselves out of there without having to rely on the goodwill of the Pakistani military.
Yeah, it truly was an incredible operation, and as Tom said, McRaven has talked about it often. So I think it's pretty obvious. Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple more questions about the raid itself, but while we're talking about Pakistan, I'm very curious if, we're looking at President Biden's plans to withdraw completely from Afghanistan, and a lot of the commentary recently has talked about how one of the critical weaknesses that we have had in the fight in Afghanistan has been the ability of our enemies to go over the border into Pakistan and seek haven. So, understanding that we're still in this position 10 years later, do you think that on reflection, realizing that we could not rely on the Pakistanis allies to work with us on this level of this kind of mission, do you think in retrospect, perhaps at some point we might have changed our relationship with Pakistan at that point, or taken any different steps that might have changed the course of our working with them or in that region over the past 10 years?
It was a tumultuous relationship with Pakistan throughout the entire effort, and it went back and forth. But the point is that during the time where we had large forces in Afghanistan, that we did have to work with with Pakistan, particularly on supply routes and things like that. Which I said earlier, that's at one point they shut down, and we had to come through the northern supply of the supply routes. It was, at times, an immensely frustrating relationship. And in fact, as we've talked about, they did, allow. They would say they might not agree with that characterization, but allow a safe haven for Al-Qaeda on their territory. We had an important counterterrorism relationship with the Pakistanis for many years, which was very important to us, frankly, during a number of years. So it was a complicated and sometimes tumultuous relationship, but one that had different elements to it that were brought forth because we did have a very large military operation in Afghanistan, 9 or 10,000 miles away from here.
I'd only add that I think over the last 10 years, as you see the Pakistani government and their inability to kind of hold that society together at times, what the future of Pakistan after we're out of Afghanistan. Some people believe that our going heavy into Afghanistan damaged the relationship with Pakistan because it began to uncover a lot of that relationship, or that relationship between the Pakistanis and Al-Qaeda, or letting them have those safe havens. But and I think I think the president is right doing what he's doing in Afghanistan. And I think at that point, maybe the Pakistanis will not have us to blame anymore for their challenges, and they'll have to get it together themselves.
Well, I want to return to the raid itself. And the SEAL Team 6 is widely celebrated. Everyone, has captured that story. But I'm curious if either of you have, other heroes to mention, other people who are behind the raid who haven't really been given, kind of credit or the same type of support and appreciation that, the SEAL team has.
There were, I don't know, dozens, if not hundreds, of analysts in the CIA for 10 years, as Tom said earlier. I remember after the raid that afternoon in the Situation Room, talking to one of the analysts, and he basically said, we had nothing for 10 years. And so the relief on their part, that so much effort was put in by the president, by his administration over a period, and then during the actual 4 months from January to the raid, I think they were most appreciative. But there's hundreds of people that no one will ever know their names and involvement. But I think more of the CIA analysts who spent years and years, and they finally got to the point where, as Tom said, they discovered enough, not maybe enough for a search warrant, but surely for an analytical presentation to the president as to why they felt that if not Bin Laden, some other very high value target. But even within the CIA, there was dispute over what the percent of chances it was Bin Laden versus someone else as a senior terrorist in his organization.
Yeah,
so
we red teamed that, remember, Bill, and people came back with different views because it wasn't an analytical case. I'd say, listen, I think that Bill's right. The persistence of our intelligence community over the course of 2 administrations, with an election in between, right, without regard to politics, the persistence of the intelligence community really is kind of is the story here. I think first and foremost, and then as you talked about, obviously the great skill, the unique American asset we have. It's interesting, on the special forces, that arose out of the disaster in the desert in 1982. When the after action reports were done, it's interesting how these things come forward. It was discovered that the United States military was not organized in a way to do these kinds of operations. They would kind of pick up teams, right? We put together kind of a unified special forces over the years, arising out of it. So the special forces. I also think, frankly, that the decision makers in the U.S. government acted, I think, with great integrity and intensity, and led by the president. This was a hard decision for the president, but I think that frankly, and Bill McRaven again has said this, that he wishes that the American people actually could have seen the deliberations, because they were done in a very, in a way I think that would make the country proud. But in the first instance, we have we have and they don't get any credit, right? Any public credit ever. But the intelligence community for years was on this through 2 administrations to bring this to a head, and it means a lot to the country, right? That he was brought to justice.
And so you say that, and I mean, I'm thinking about this cold trail that there was for years and years. Was there a sense in whether in the administration or in the intelligence community that we're gonna get bin Laden, it's going to happen, or was this this moment so unique that put a lot of pressure on the ability to do something with it? I mean, as you mentioned, there weren't photos of bin Laden there, so this is something that it must have been a pretty special moment for us to move on that.
Well, it wasn't. There was a lot of evidence and reason to believe that this was not just a high value target, but there was probably only one other target of the level to warrant all of what went around that compound in support of whoever was in. So it wasn't as though it was totally sort of a shot in the dark by any means. And and again, only the U.S. intelligence agencies and military had the capacity to do the sort of things that they did over those couple of months to give more and more credence, not just to the fact that it may have been bin Laden, more importantly, that there was enough evidence to justify the ultimate potential sacrifice of putting people in. And let me just say, back to a point Tom made about the prospect that possibly the Pakistani army or the police would get involved. It really was the president. And one of the original plans, as I remember, McRaven came into the president, had a pretty skinny down team with no sort of support in country if something went wrong. And it was the president who immediately said, no way, you're not staying. I think somebody said, we'll fight until we have to give up. And the president was like, no, and I want the capacity to prevent that and get everybody out of there if need be. And that required the military to do some things that have been noted, to have ability to come in if something went wrong, and something did go wrong immediately with one of the only 2 helicopters on site.
Yeah, it's interesting, Lizzie, on your question about the cold case. And it was cold. Just say a couple of things about it. One, this was this concept of American persistence in the intelligence community to going back over the evidence, constantly going back over evidence and see if you can connect dots, and then obviously pursuing the leads, right, really aggressively with respect to the what brought us to Abbottabad. I think that's as Bill said, on the president, as we said, insisted that the United States be able to take care of itself in this situation and not rely on the goodwill or of any other force. And if something had happened there, again, Admiral McRaven's talked about this, all the assets of the United States would have been brought to bear to ensure that our service people get out of there.
Well, we've been getting a lot of really good audience questions, so I'm going to go ahead and shift over to some of those right now. And a reminder for people who are watching, if you have questions, you can go to ccga.live and either ask your own questions or vote on some of the questions that we already have. So first question that has come in, and I'm very curious of the answer on this. What was plan B if bin Laden had not been found in the compound?
They would have left empty-handed there and then go back to square one and start all over again. But ramifications, many of the political ramifications would have been the same as what occurred, or maybe not as bad, because quite frankly, the fact that he was there and we did what we had to do totally opened up the Pakistani government to the question and the criticism of, if he's there, why didn't you know it? And who did and who didn't know it? So, but from a sort of practical sense, we would have just gone back to square one.
It's interesting, Lizzie, on that question. It's on the criticism in Pakistan, as Bill said, they did a post-action parliamentary report in Pakistan, which was very critical of the government for not being able to either not knowing or that he was there or preventing us from doing what we did. I think one of the reasons that the president chose the raid as opposed to some other options that he had is because of that. That if the United States had gone there and he wasn't there, the forces would have gone back to Jalalabad, and that would have been the end of the story.
So I've got a,
it's kind of, I don't know, kind of nothing to see here.
yeah, and presumably, I mean, if that had been the case, then, I mean, where would we have gone with our continued hunt? It would have might have just revealed a lot of information that what we were tracking at the time.
Yeah, and also, that was one of the reasons why operational security was so important, and why as we got deeper into the process, and more people knew, you worried about it leaking. And if it had leaked, the prospect is he would have escaped, and we wouldn't have seen him for another number of years. So that was a contingency.
And Tom, the possibility of leakage, the president was in the Situation Room quite often the last number of weeks, to the point where, when the president moves even within the White House, where he's at. And when he's down in the Situation Room repeatedly with the most senior people in military and intelligence, usually people begin to chatter about what that may be about. And so that was a constant concern of mine as chief of staff, that, he's down there so much, he moves around, number one. And then the second part was, which was really amazing, early on, the CIA had to go to Congress to get a reprogramming of some funds to move certain assets. And the Congress, the leadership, the four leaders of the Congress, or of the Intelligence Committee, I think it was, or the Appropriations, were briefed on, not that it was Osama Bin Laden, but there was an operation regarding a high value target, blah, blah, blah. And that never leaked. And that briefing of them was done like in February or early March. And the fact that didn't leak from the Hill, to me, was the biggest surprise of this whole thing. Not that Bin Laden was there, not that we didn't pull it off, but the fact that it didn't leak, especially from Congress, was quite amazing.
Yeah, it's a committee that was in the best tradition of that committee, right? To treat things obviously with the utmost seriousness. On the secrecy part and not leaking, it is amazing in Washington D.C. that for 8 months you have a lot of things going on with respect to maybe one of the most important national security goals that we had at that point, and nothing leaked. I certainly learned a couple of lessons. One, go low tech, right? We didn't have a lot of electronic communications with respect to any of this, including people's schedules, just saying meeting and things like that. And the other lesson, which is the life lesson, I guess, for all of us, if you want to keep a secret, don't tell anybody.
I'll follow up on that just to say, do you think that it would be possible to keep something in the political nature and environment we have in Washington today, to keep something like that close hold with Congress?
I do. I think so. But remember, Osama Bin Laden was unique. If you had a similar situation today, I do have enough confidence in the leadership, the political leadership that Tom mentioned, the bipartisanship. On this sort of thing, I do believe it would stay. Whether the, hundreds of people who had to be involved in all of this, from the military to the intelligence to Tom's operation, there were very, 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 other than Tom and myself in the White House, I think we were the only staff people in his staff involved in this.
We have a very popular audience question. Has there been any subsequent evidence that the Pakistan government or military had knowledge that Bin Laden was in that compound?
Tom,
I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't seen any. I haven't seen anything definitive on that, frankly, Lizzie. And I know that there've been some books written about it that allege that in fact that the Pakistani intelligence services had set him up there. But I've not seen anything that would lead me to believe that was the case, or that it wasn't the case. I haven't seen anything definitive on that, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. They reacted in the way they didn't react. They as the forces were in the compound, right? There were reactions taking place, which didn't indicate any foreknowledge. But I don't know the answer to that question, to be totally honest with you.
It is hard to believe, though, and this is just a layman, that I think it was probably more nobody wanted to know. So that's probably more likely.
Yeah, and there are divisions and kind of cells within the Pakistani military, particularly within their intelligence services. But I don't know the answer to that question.
That's fair. I think that Bill's suggestion is fair also. Another popular audience question: what was the impact of taking out Bin Laden on global terrorism? Was the impact as great as you had hoped?
Tom?
Yeah, sure. I think it was yes. It was part of our campaign, but it was a strategic part of the campaign. It was a strategic blow to Al-Qaeda. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And put them into some disarray. And of course, over the years since, the United States has put incredible pressure on Al-Qaeda over the years to where it is a much diminished force today, certainly than it was at that time. And indeed, if you look at the last week in front of the Congress, they had the worldwide threat briefings given by Bill Burns and Avril Haines, the CIA director and the director of national intelligence, which said that Al-Qaeda was a much diminished force, not gone away, still a threat, but its ability to kind of plan and launch operations against the homeland have been greatly diminished. And I think that's the case.
And his personality and his profile, you could feel the sort of air going out of the balloon of Al-Qaeda immediately. Didn't mean that they weren't still out there causing problems, but in a very different way than they had before, because there was a cult of personality around Osama bin Laden. And the fact, which kind of, if I remember correctly, kind of surprised all of us, the fact that they admitted relatively quickly that it was him and he was dead was kind of shocking, because I think what was expected, that they would either deny that he was there, say it was all a ruse, was a Hollywood movie, whatever, but they didn't. And that, I think, was probably more by virtue of the fact that their leadership was totally decimated in many, many ways when he was taken out.
Yeah. One of the things we had to do, of course, on the evening of May 2nd, right, was to, before the president went to the East Room and the White House and announced to the nation that Osama bin Laden had been killed, we had to be sure. And Bill, you'll remember the work that went on. Some of it technical, some of it not. And Bill McRaven has described. He had a picture and a profile of Osama bin Laden, who was 6 foot something or something like that. And he asked one of his team members who seemed about the right height to lie down next to to try to get a sense of the dimensions. But we went through obviously photographs and other technical ways to find out who it was. But that was an important point that we had to satisfy ourselves to a fairly high degree that in fact that the person who had been killed in that compound that night was Osama bin Laden, particularly when as we were going to have the president. The president was going to make a statement to the nation and the world that night.
Right. And we had no DNA of he himself. So that made it more difficult. But the confidence level was absolute by the time the people finished in Islamabad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've got another question from an audience member here who says that he or she first met Admiral Bill McRaven, since we're speaking of, roughly 15 months after the raid. And even as someone who has interacted with a wide range of active duty military personnel, found him to be almost preternaturally calm and collected.
Yeah.
How much did the personal trust of senior elected officials and the members of the Special Forces leadership affect the go decision? I think you both kind of alluded to this, but Bill, do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt the president's confidence, as Tom said, because he had seen them in action during the previous 2 years of his being in office. So the comfort level of when they said something that they could do or would do or how to do it, the president had absolute confidence in that. So, and McRaven is, a rather impressive fellow. And so when he'd walk in, with whatever case he was making for this, it was just always a cool, calm presentation with a lot of certainty behind himself, not hubris that was misplaced, but real confidence in what he said.
You know, it's interesting, Lizzie, on that point on Bill McRaven. He had, and the president certainly knew this, and we had been involved in some, but by this point in Admiral McRaven's career, he had been involved in thousands of these operations, thousands that he either oversaw or participated in, and had really been part of the development of the skill set and assets that the United States had in its special forces. So a lot of confidence comes from that, with a person who has done this in Iraq and Afghanistan hundreds and I think thousands of times during the course of his career, either overseeing or participating in these things. The second thing is, I'll tell a story, which is that it goes to Bill's point about confidence in McRaven personally. And McRaven has told this story as well. When we had the first meeting with him and the president in the Situation Room, the president, went through the various options, and he said to McRaven, "Admiral, can you do this? Can you pull this off?" And there was no hubris. There was absolutely no problem, right? McRaven said, I'll never forget it, "I don't know, sir. I have to go work with my planners and with my team, and I'll get back to you, and I'll let you know whether we can do it or not." And he said, "How long is that going to take?" He said, 3 weeks. And you could see, it's interesting, you could see the confidence in him build at that moment with the president, which was he was being totally honest, right? No false bravado, none of that stuff, because he didn't have to do any of that given his record, right? And it was an important moment. Yes, so Lizzie, I do think that the personal confidence in McRaven, and more broadly in the special forces, had a lot to do with the confidence to do this. And of course, we saw, Admiral McRaven and his teams, incredible calm under, in incredibly tough circumstances. When the helicopter came down hard, crashed hard, and at the compound, and they had planned against the contingency, and that they just carried on, and it was hard to detect any change in their, kind of in their voice levels or anything. It was just, all right, A didn't work, we're going to do B. And they had obviously planned against all these contingencies. So those three things, I think that the experience, the personal interaction, and you saw it in action during the raid. But McRaven's a very special person.
And they were so prepared. I remember the pilot of the helicopter. Basically, they knew that there was a possibility that because of the 12-foot high wall, that as the air pushed down from the helicopter, it wouldn't be able to go out, and it'd cause the helicopter to begin to stir. And they had practiced that. So the move to try to get to the compound, and if the tail got stuck on the wall, which it did, he had to make a split decision to stick the nose in the ground so it didn't roll over and injure, if not kill, the occupants in the helicopter. Those are split-second decisions, but they had practiced, and they were so disciplined with it that they were ready for the unexpected to happen, and it did.
Yeah, that it's really remarkable that people can react that quickly and decisively under such pressure. But that's what makes our military so impressive. We've got time for one last question from the audience as we wrap up. As we look at the death of Bin Laden was a huge milestone, and a departure from Afghanistan will be another major milestone. Do you gentlemen believe that if we do fully pull out of Afghanistan, that we might be approaching the end of the post 9/11 era?
I'll
let Tom start on that one.
Well, listen, I think that the president's decision is the correct decision from a variety of perspectives. Lizzie, one is that the president of the United States needs to sit in the situation room that we've been describing and to look at the whole globe and the threat matrix, the threats that face the country at that time. And the threat matrix looks different today than it did 10 years ago and than it did 20 years ago. And we have emergent challenges, obviously in Asia and elsewhere around the world. So if you take it from that perspective, you would not have a significant military force in Afghanistan today. If you're going to look at the world and say, how do I allocate my forces? Because the world has changed, as was described by the intelligence chiefs, as I said earlier, a couple of weeks ago. And indeed, and the threat, the terrorist threat, has not gone away, but it has dispersed, and it is in various other places around the world, right? In the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Africa, in the Sahel, and so it doesn't have a geographic center, and so it needs to be dealt with in that way. And and third, we have the capability, I think, given our intelligence and our kind of our standoff military capabilities to deal with this. Should, in fact, Al-Qaeda try to reconstitute and threaten the United States. I have a lot of confidence that our intelligence would see that, and that we would have the ability to deal with that. So the world's changed, and as the world changes, as different threats emerge, and that threat matrix that look around the globe looks different, the United States has to and should adjust.
I don't think there's any doubt. I think that we are obviously 20 years next fall, much better prepared for such an attack in this country. And I think the raid on May 2nd, 2011, helped to decimate that organized terror group and their total focus on terrorism in the United States. And not total, but primary focus, causing us injury, which they did on 9/11. So I think it's going to be a better situation when we get out and we refocus on what are real threats for the next number of years in the 21st century.
Yeah, and the terror threat hasn't gone away. So these it's a cliche now, but that we have to be right all the time. The terrorist only has to be right one time or get a break one time to pull up an operation. That's still the case today, and they are, as I said, dispersed around the world. So the threat is there, but we're much better at this than we were 20 years ago. That's for sure. And we have other threats in the world priorities in the world that need the attention of the president of the United States and our assets.
Well, thank you to everybody who tuned in today live. And just a reminder as we close, a recording of this conversation will be available for playback on the council's social channels and the website very shortly. But I just want to say a special thank you to our panelists, Tom and Bill. This has been a fascinating conversation to get to be part of. It was really a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for taking time to join us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie.